I've been working on my doodle cloth in preparation for today's lesson, and of course, you've been working on your actual sampler. So you most likely have done this on your sampler piece. And I ask you to do the first couple of letters in these 2 rows, and that will be so that we will be in the right place to do the herringbone stitch. As you see, I sort of shortchanged the lesson and only did the first letters in those rows. But before I get into today's lesson, I have a chart correction to share with you. This is something that I did not notice until I was actually stitching the first blossom and realized that this part of the flower was not symmetrical. So I went back and looked at my original sampler and that I stitched in 1996 and realized that indeed there is a stitch missing here and here in that same position going all the way across. So do make that correction in your chart and in your stitching. The other thing that I did not mention and didn't frankly even think about when I was teaching the first lesson is that when stitching the blossom, I asked you to leave this part vacant for today's lesson. That is the dark olive green, which is symbol 2. And so what makes sense going forward will be to stitch these 3 stitches, tunnel under these existing stitches in preparation for doing this, and then tunnel under to do these 3. So after you have stitched all the other colors, save color number 2 until you're ready to do the center. And that will make your stitching more efficient going forward. Your stitch instructions are on page 7, and this is a 2-step stitch. We're going to make 11, basically they're satin stitches, filling in that square. So the first stitch is going to cover just 1 intersection, and then we'll drop down 1 thread and cross over 2 intersections, and then come back here and start stitch number 3. And notice that all of our stitches will be even at the top and on the sides. And because we have left this area vacant, the counting is really simple. When we get to the largest stitch, then we'll start getting shorter and shorter. Once we've done the step 1 and we're finished at this point, we then will bring our thread back up here and only cover half of the area with similar stitches. So let's get started. So I've already stitched these 3 number 2 symbols in the dark olive green, and this of course is the area that we're going to be filling now. So I'm going to tunnel under just a couple of stitches on the back, just so that I won't have a loose thread on the back. So the first stitch is just this little teeny tiny one up here in the corner. Crossing over that 1 intersection. And then we're going to come down 1 thread into the very next hole and cross over to the hole next to the one where we just stitched. So we're actually covering 2 intersections, but I'm not necessarily counting intersections at this point. Each time I'm just coming down 1 thread on the left and over 1 thread across the top. Down 1 thread on the left. And across 1 thread on the top. Now this is easy with flower thread. If you were stitching this with floss, you would need to be making sure that the two strands were parallel to each other with each one of these stitches. And that's why I particularly like flower thread for this type of a stitch. So this is our longest stitch, and it's going from corner to corner. And now we start across the bottom, just coming over one thread. And on this side, and this is where I need to come in a little closer, because I need to make sure that, yeah, would have been easy to have missed that hole right there. So do make sure that each time you're coming down one thread and over one thread. It's very easy to miss one. So sometimes I will put my needle in the last hole so that I know that I'm jumping over one thread to get to the next hole. Now, in case you're wondering, it would have been perfectly possible to execute this stitch before doing the blossom. But what I find is that it's just really hard to make sure that you've got the exact right spot to place the stitch. By doing the rest of the flower first, then you know with a certainty that you've got the cross-cornered cushion stitch in the right spot. And then the last stitch is just going over this last little intersection. Okay, so that's step one. Now, in case you're wondering, so I just finished down here, so why don't I just start this next stitch right here? I find that I get better coverage if I'm bringing my needle up to this corner instead. Whoops, there you go, right there. There's something about the pathway of the stitch that's different. So now each stitch I'm still coming down one and over one, but I'm only doing half the stitch. I should say I'm only doing half the square. I'm going out of focus and off camera every once in a while because I'm having difficulty seeing the holes. Like right now, I'm stitching by just looking at the back of my camera, and sometimes that's not the best way for me to see exactly where I'm supposed to be stitching. Like I'm pretty sure that that stitch is wrong, and it is. Can you see where the angle is different? So just bear with me while I take that one out. Okay, that's where I'm supposed to be. And now the last stitch is just over one intersection. So you're really going from the middle of this cross stitch over to the middle of this cross stitch. And that finishes the cross corner cushion stitch. It's really nice how it catches the light and really adds a nice texture. So now on the back, I'm going to tunnel under. And of course, if you've already stitched the letters C symbols on this side, you can skip this step, but going forward, the other blossoms that you do, this is probably what you're going to be doing. Just bringing your thread under and adding these last 3 stitches. I don't mind showing you the back of my work here. You can see that it's a mess. There's just a lot going on. And this is where it's just really important to secure your working thread by slipping it under existing stitches, but then making sure that you cut off the excess tail right down to the end, so you're not having a lot of loose threads on the back. You may have filled in your fishbone stitch under the row of ABC that we did last week on your doodle cloth, and then under the PQR row is where we're going to be doing the herringbone stitch. And we're going to actually start with a compensating stitch so that we have a complete X up here. But basically, once we get that little compensating stitch out of the way, we're simply coming over here, under a couple, up here, under a couple, etc. So let's take a look at the stitch diagram, which I think is on page 8, maybe? Yes, on page 8. This is the one trip herringbone stitch, and you know, I just realized is that I have this kind of upside down. It's not incorrect, but on our stitch diagram, our first stitch is not down here, it's actually up here. I mean, on the chart, the first stitch is up here, not down here. I'll have to go back and fix that, I think. But essentially, it's the same concept. Other than when you're compensating, the herringbone stitch is very, very simple. We're going to be going on the diagonal. The whole row is 4 threads high. So let's just take a look at just not looking at the compensating idea. So if we go from here, we're going over 4 and up 4. And once we've established that pattern, the rest of it's very simple. We're going to scoop under 2 threads and then come down here and scoop under 2 threads, come up here, scoop under 2 threads. So I'm going to start with that compensating stitch, and I'm going to follow the chart more than the diagram, which I hope isn't going to confuse you too terribly much. I'm not saying this to justify my mistake, but once you learn how to do a stitch, when you look at the chart, then you'll know where the placement is. So we're actually going to start with a half cross from here to here. So that's just going to be leaving 1 square unworked below our row of alphabets, which is 2 linen threads. So from the corner of our P, we're going to count down 2, 4 threads, and over 2 threads, and be sharing a hole with our side border. So we're stitching with medium mauve now, and our first stitch is going to be right in this area. Now this is when I'm going to show you how to do the away waist knot. Now I'm going to use my fingers as kind of a way of measuring to make sure that I put my waist knot far enough away that when I'm all done, I'm going to clip that knot, rethread my needle, and that's when I'll be burying the beginning tail. So you want to make sure that the knot is far enough away that you're going to have a long enough piece of thread to be able to thread your needle easily. So we're going to actually make the first stitch from what would be the lower left-hand corner to the upper right-hand corner. Now make sure you don't pull that first stitch too hard, otherwise you'll just end up doing this. So you don't want to do that. Don't worry about the tension on that first stitch. We can always correct it when we're getting ready to bury the thread. So the first half cross is going from bottom left to upper right, and I'm going to scoop up these 2 threads to complete that stitch and put me in the position to begin the next stitch. So from there, I'm going to count over 2 more threads and down to 4 threads. Now you may remember that I mentioned that the stitch is 4 threads wide, and it is because we're actually starting from back here. Be coming a little bit closer. And then my next stitch, I'm simply counting from this corner of this stitch, I'm going to skip 2 threads and pick up 2 threads. And down here, I'm going to skip 2 threads, pick up 2 threads. Now this stitch can be done poke and pull. It doesn't have to be done sewing, but it is so easy to do it as a sewing motion. So each time from the previous existing stitch, you're skipping 2 linen threads and scooping up the next 2 linen threads. And each time your needle is pointing to the left. So skipping 2 threads, picking up 2 threads. Skipping 2 threads, picking up 2 threads. So you can see just how quick and easy a row of herringbone stitches are. And that's it. Now for burying the waist knot. We've left our waist knot up here, and we can either clip it off on this side, but I actually like to just come around to the back and clip it off. And we call it a waist knot because it's wasted. I'm just going to toss that away. So now, and you can see where it's really important to leave this thread long enough that I can now thread it in my needle and be ready to bury it. In fact, I would say, even though I thought I was leaving plenty of room, it's actually kind of skimpy. When you see what it looks like on the back of a herringbone stitch, you have kind of 2 parallel rows of single stitches. You can see where it's kind of hard to bury the beginning tail with, say, a buried waist knot, because you're not going to be able to, you don't have perpendicular stitches on the back to catch it. So what I'm going to actually do is kind of go back and forth between these stitches. So I'm going to slip under this one and then come up here and slip under this one. And this keeps the back flat and reduces the bulk. Now you can also just do it on one row. I could just come under this one and then under this one. Either way. What you don't want to do though is to whip stitch it. You want to make sure that you're keeping this back flat. And by that I mean what you don't want to do, and it's kind of hard for me to show you what not to do here. But if each time, if I came under this stitch and then under the next one from the top, I would end up whipping it over these stitches and I'll end up with a ridge. If you do run out of thread while you're doing a row of herringbone stitches, that might be a reason to end your thread in this manner so that you'll have these stitches available to bury the beginning thread. So you don't need to do the away waste knot if you are extending a row with a new thread. You can simply bury it in the existing stitches.